Welcome to a new edition of Will You Stop the Podcast. This is Brandon. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to actually do a little Q&A with Avi. Avi is a very skilled practitioner of the history of professional wrestling, and honestly, he's my Wikipedia. What's up, Avi? How are we doing today?
Well, not too good. Giants are basically ruining my night some more. It has not been a fun draft night for me.
Well, I hope in my heart of hearts that they could somehow turn it around for you, because I know how big of a Giants fan you are, of a New York market sports fan you are. But we're going to get started. Let's talk some wrestling. So I got a bunch of questions. We're going to start with some questions. So you can fill us in with a little bit of history as you answer them. And then we're going to do a little speed round. And the speed round is basically I'm going to give you a name, and you're going to give me your first thoughts about them. So let's start off with who, in your opinion, is the best booker of all time?
You know, by money made, obviously, you got to look at Vince McMahon. I mean, he took the business from, bingo halls and National Guard armories to a national television contract with the Fox network. But as far as actual booker of angles and things of that nature, I got to go Dusty Rhodes. I mean, to me, Dusty Rhodes, he booked the NWA Crockett territory for years. He was the guy who basically invented Starrcade. He invented War Games. He invents the Dusty finish, which obviously, as we know, is still used today and definitely not fun. We actually once witnessed the Dusty finish right in front of us when we thought Ric Flair beat Randy Savage for the belt at the Coliseum, only to find out that Ric Flair got disqualified. So with saying that, you look at Pat Patterson, for instance. Pat Patterson borrowed a lot of ideas. He's given credit for the Royal Rumble, but I believe his name was Eddie Shire, or Eddie Sharkey, one or the other. He was the booker over in San Fran back in the 60s and 70s that actually did a Royal Rumble-like battle royal. So that's basically where Pat Patterson's career started. So he borrowed that idea, quote unquote. But I would say as far as finishers go, Pat Patterson by far and away is the best finisher of all time. To me, a match is only as good as the finish. You can have a great match, but if the finish goes to hell, you don't have much of a match. And if you actually think about it, it's amazing to me is that Eric Bischoff back in '98, I believe it was, he mentioned on one of his podcasts, he tried to hire Pat Patterson away from the WWE because he knew he needed a finisher guy. Another one I give a lot of credit to, Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman took ECW from a dinky bingo hall in the middle of South Philly and basically changed wrestling forever. It's basically because of him that we had attitude. It's because of ECW that WCW got the luchadors, if you think about it. A lot of the NWO and, Eric Bischoff using real names and that black and white, gray area sort of thing in wrestling really came from ECW. So, if you look at it, he took a roster with a lot of rejects from WCW and WWE and turned it into the biggest thing. If you think about it, it probably changed wrestling more than any other company has in the last, 30 some odd years.
Would you say that Paul Heyman and Dusty Rhodes could be in the same conversation with their minds and their creative juices that they had?
Oh, absolutely. Their innovativeness, if that's even a word, I guess, their innovative abilities. I mean, those two are minds that we haven't seen since or before that even. You can talk about George Scott. He booked the WWF back in the mid-'80s, their peak of the golden era. But Vince is the guy that's the final say. So even though George Scott might be booking something or writing something, he's the final say, obviously, as Vince. So Vince is really the booker. But if you look at, actual innovations, you got to go Paul Heyman and Dusty Rhodes to me. To me, Dusty Rhodes is the quintessential example of how to book a long feud, where he gets you really to root for the face and he gets you to really hate the heel. A perfect example is that, he's feuding with Ric Flair. They main event Starrcade 84 and 85 together. That was pretty much your main feud for the NWA in the mid-'80s. It was Rhodes versus Flair. I'd say those two pretty much feuded on and off from 1981 to probably around 1987, early 88, give or take. And You can kind of tell the feud is starting to wane a little bit, and Flair might be getting a little more pop than you would like for your top heel. And they have a cage match, and this cage match was actually televised between Nikita Koloff and Ric Flair. And at some point, the Russians jump in, and they jump Flair, and they start beating him up in the ring. And Dusty Rhodes comes to the ring to save Flair. And you figure at this point, watching wrestling back then, your top face comes to save your top heel. They're going to shake hands, kind of like the way the Mega Powers did, and they're going to, battle it out against the evil Russians. Crowd's going insane. And just like that, Dusty Rhodes takes the crowd away when he has Ric Flair and the Horsemen turn on him after he just saved Ric Flair. They turn on him. They break his leg. He gives one of the greatest shoots of all time when he talks about the working man and being down and out. And it actually reignites the Flair Rhodes feud, and it keeps that feud going for another couple of years. So to me, on that level where he got the crowd in and out and really got you going, that's where Rhodes really knew how to sell the product. The innovative side of Paul Heyman is where he took a roster. I mean, look at his main event roster for all those years. Guys like Sabu, guys like Taz, Shane Douglas, the Eliminators, the Gangsters, and guys like that, and then, Rob Van Dam even. And Mike Awesome and guys like that. And he took these guys that really weren't going anywhere at any of the federations. A lot of them were jobbers in WWF and WCW. I mean, you look at Raven. He was Johnny Polo in WWF and becomes probably their biggest heel for a couple of years, where he took whatever you gave him and made it shine. Lance Storm, a guy with zero personality, makes him shine. Taz, a midget who claimed he knew judo, made him shine. So, on that level, his gift was, cover up the negatives, extenuate the positives, and turn into one hell of a show.
Like I think Taz used to say, land of misfit toys.
Basically.
All right, so going back to the whole Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes angle you were just talking about, would you consider that one of the defining moments in wrestling history?
For the NWA, yes. But if you're talking defining moments in the history of wrestling, it's got to be Hogan Andre, that entire feud. I mean, that leads to WrestleMania 3, 93,000 people, at least to 33 million people watching on NBC when Hogan drops the belt to Andre. To me, that takes WWF and really takes wrestling from being big to being gargantuan. I mean, just the ratings and everything else just went through the roof as soon as that feud happens. So that's to me, that's one of your spotlight moments in wrestling history. If I have to go with some, as far as a feud goes, there are other obvious spotlight moments in the history of wrestling. You got to look at, you got to look at the first Raw, the first Nitro. Coming up when you have SmackDown moving or Fox, that's going to be one of those huge moments in wrestling history. The Montreal Screwjob has to be up there, obviously. Vince buying WCW, not so much ECW, but I think WCW in the sense where you go with that dual broadcast, with WCW and WWE, where McMahon shows up on Nitro. Now you're watching on TNT, Raw finishing up. I mean, to me, it was surreal in so many ways. Those are your moments that I think really catapult wrestling to that next stratosphere, so to speak.
Would you consider Scott Hall showing up at Nitro a defining moment in wrestling history, or just the beginning of a great angle?
Beginning of a great angle. I think Hogan dropping the leg and Hogan telling the fans to stick it, that's where the payoff is. We've discussed the NWO angle before. Hall shows up. We all knew Hall was showing up. We all knew it was an angle when he first started. I mean, kids obviously didn't, but if back then we were calling, the Coach Kurt hotline. We were reading the after mags. We were keeping up with Dave Meltzer and guys like that already. So we already knew that Hall was going to show up. We knew Nash was going to show up. So it wasn't, huge on that sense. But, if Sting is telling the fans to, to stick it, or, somebody else telling the fans to stick it, that's not going to be a defining moment in wrestling history. Hulk Hogan telling the fans to stick it, there's your defining moment in wrestling history.
I agree with that. I think without question, that is the greatest heel turn in wrestling history.
Absolutely. I mean, there's been more shocking heel turns, but that's the greatest heel turn ever. I think another great moment in wrestling history is, Mr. McMahon becoming Mr. McMahon when he steps in the ring with Stone Cold Steve Austin I believe it was April 13th, 1998. It ends WCW's dominance in the wrestling rating war, but also really brings us Mr. McMahon in the ring. I mean, Vince McMahon was getting in the ring.
Yeah, that is something that no one ever thought. And I think that was also around the time they actually started to acknowledge that he was the owner. Because before that, he just played the announcer.
I think
he never
they acknowledged him as the owner back in the 80s when they did 2020. So if you paid attention, I mean, obviously as kids we didn't, but the adults knew Vince McMahon owned it. When the steroid trial happened, the newspapers covered it pretty heavily over here in New York. I'm not sure about the rest of the country, but the Post and Daily News pretty much covered it throughout the entire trial. So at this point, I'm 16, 17 years old. I think it started in 92, so we're 15 years old when it started. We were reading the papers. We knew he was the owner. I believe already back in, I think he did a shoot once about Phil Mushnick, and that was around 93, 94. So they've made various suggestions he was the owner, and they obviously made it known in the papers or whatnot. I believe that it make it known in WWE programming probably until around 97 when him and Hart had their issues. And then I believe, I think it was a Raw, either end of 97, early 98, where I believe Walter Payton came through and they were going to give Vince McMahon an award for giving the charitable contributions. Of course, they made a whole joke that his check bounced. That was the first time they really mentioned him as the principal owner of the WWF, I believe.
I actually have a good question for you. Why did the steroid trial take place in Hempstead, New York, and not in Connecticut where he lived?
Because he was prosecuted in New York. It was basically the New York prosecutor going after him, even though actually the doctor was in Pennsylvania. It was a federal trial, so for the federal district, that's where they prosecuted him. It wasn't a local thing. If it was local, it would have been Connecticut. Actually, if it was local, it would have been Pennsylvania, because Dr. Zahorian was actually a doctor in Pennsylvania. But because he was brought up on federal charges, that goes to the federal circuit. Federal circuit happens to be either Long Island or happens to be in Brooklyn, depending on where they prosecute you. So it was actually a federal trial. That's why.
While we're talking about it, why don't you let our listeners know who would have taken over if Vince did go to jail and was found guilty? What was the plan that you're aware of what they were going to do? And if he was found guilty, do you think WWE would be where it's at today?
Yeah, the company would have been fine. I mean, when it was all said and done, I think by the time they dropped the charges, the most Vince was looking at was a year. When it first started, they were talking about how he was going to do 13 years in prison. Then it got dropped down to 8 years in prison. And by the time Vince's lawyers were done whittling down the charges, the most he would have done was a year, if I understand, maybe 2 years tops. The word that I get is that Linda would have kept running the business side of things, and that, believe it or not, Jerry Jarrett was brought in by Vince to run the book, so to speak, with Pat Patterson, where him and Patterson and allegedly Bruce Pritchard were going to be sort of a tribunal of sorts to basically decide the direction of the company. What I got is Jerry Jarrett would have been your booker. Pat Patterson would have basically been your finisher. They would have worked together, obviously, and Bruce Pritchard would have had his say as well. But yeah, Jerry Jarrett was going to come in and actually run the day-to-day operations as far as the wrestling operations went if things went bad with the steroid trial.
And let's be real, Vince would probably be like some mafioso in jail giving orders from via pigeons through the bars and the windows to get his ideas out there.
Yeah,
it wouldn't be like Vince wouldn't be involved at all.
Bruce already mentioned that. Bruce already said that Vince would have ran it from jail, and that they would have had to. Bruce already said they would have had to have gone visit, Vince at jail probably at least once a week, and they would have gone over the, the books, the bookings, and the storylines there.
All right, let's move on to my next question, and we're going to split this into two categories. We're going to talk greatest world champions ever, but the first half of this question is, as far as work rate only, who do you feel is some of the greatest world champions of all time?
As far as in-ring ability, you got to go back to the Bob Backlund. Guy always had great matches. Randy Savage, great worker. Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, both great workers. You got to look at Chris Jericho. You got to talk about Kurt Angle. You got to put John Cena in there. People knock John Cena, but he had some great matches, in his career. Recently, AJ Styles, great worker. Those are the guys I would say WWF-wise are some of your greatest workers of all time. As far as other federations go, you got to look at Ric Flair, obviously, Ricky Steamboat. Even though he was a WCW International Champion, quote-unquote, Rick Rude is somebody you have to look at. One of my favorites ever, and he was only champion for a short time. Next week they have the special about the Von Erich family, and Kerry Von Erich was only champion for a short time. I know Vince wanted him really bad in 84, 85. Fritz asked him to back off, and WCCW World Class was pretty much on the verge of overtaking the AWA as your number 3 federation of the country behind WWF and NWA. And Vince actually had so much respect for Fritz that he actually backed off and didn't sign Kerry. And I have to wonder, had that gone through, how much better off Kerry would have been, going up north to Vince. Maybe he actually would have calmed things down. Those are probably your guys who I could see with your best work rate, so to speak. Barry Windham is the guy you got to put in there. He was NWA champion, one of the best workers you'd ever see.
All right, and what about as far as impact on the business? Because it's one thing to be able to work in the ring, but to have – we all know Hulk Hogan's name's in this conversation. We also know he wasn't a technical wizard in the ring. So guys are more like that impacted the business as far as to be a world champion.
Obviously you got to look at Hulk Hogan. I'm going to bring back John Cena, Macho Man Randy Savage, The Rock, Austin. Those guys all transcended into mainstream media, and they were huge for the business. There's other guys. I mean, on the WCW side, I guess you can, I guess Sting maybe for a short time. He didn't transcend the business, so to speak, but, he was kind of their franchise player. But those are probably your biggest ones as far as I guess box office attraction goes.
What about Bruno? Where would he fall in this conversation?
To me, honestly, I look at Bruno as a territorial wrestler. To me, he was nothing more than a Nick Bockwinkel for the Northeast, for instance. Nick Bockwinkel was a huge champion of the AWA, but that's all he was a big champion of the AWA. Harley Race was a big champion of the NWA. Ric Flair, until the NWA went national, was an NWA champion. To me, he was one of those guys, Bruno, that it was a territorial champion. He was big in the Northeast, but, in the South and the West, I don't think he was that big. I'll give you a guy who actually was a huge box office attraction and probably one of Vince McMahon Sr.'s biggest blunders, Superstar Billy Graham. Superstar Billy Graham was probably the first guy that was so white hot as a heel, he started getting cheered as a face. No matter what he did, no matter how much he cheated, he actually got cheered. And it was amazing to me thinking back then that he was only given, I think it was a 9, maybe 10-month reign with the belt until it was put on Bob Backlund. And Bob Backlund was never huge over in the Northeast. He got cheered. He was a good worker, but nowhere near like Superstar Billy Graham. I feel that if Superstar Billy Graham kept that belt and if Vince McMahon Sr. would have seen the bigger picture, I think that would have been huge because if you think about it, he eventually would have became a face. He was getting the pops as it was. And the WWE, even to this day, has always been a face territory. That's one of the balls that I think that the company dropped with Superstar Billy Graham. But back to Bruno, like I said, territorial guy, just like Nick Bockwinkel, just like Harley Race before him, just a territorial guy.
How about guys who never held that big world title? Obviously AWA was considered their title a world title. But we're talking WCW or WWF/WWE. So I have guys like Ravishing Rick Rude, Rick Martel, Kurt Hennig, maybe Roddy Piper or Scott Hall. Anyone come to mind who you feel never had that opportunity and could have had that ball and ran with it and been a great world champion?
I would say Jake the Snake Roberts. And it was funny because Jake Roberts was actually about to get put into a feud with Hulk Hogan. And he DDTs Hulk Hogan on the snake pit, and the crowd goes nuts. And there's a story where he goes backstage, and Vince goes, "Yeah, you have no luck, my friend," and was going to scrape the entire angle. And what happened was Jake actually convinced Vince to give them a main event at a house show. I believe they did a house show at Providence, Rhode Island. Sold the place out. He gets hit with the DDT, Hogan. And the crowd goes nuts. Hogan kicks out, hulks up, hits the 3 punches, big boot and leg drop, and the crowd boos. And at that point, Vince dropped the entire idea. But yeah, Jake is somebody I could see. Barry Windham was NWA champion, but he was somebody I could have seen as WCW or WWE champion. People talk about David Von Erich. David Von Erich believe it or not, was a corny ass face. But there's clips of him in Florida as a heel, and when you watch him, it's almost like he's a better in-ring worker. He's almost like an earlier Randy Orton, where he didn't have the charisma per se of a Randy Orton, but he had the ring ability of Randy Orton. That's a guy I could have seen possibly as a world champion as well.
All right. What about some ultimate dream matches? Give me some guys from the late 70s, 80s versus some guys maybe from today that you would love to have seen have that dream match. I mean, I know WrestleMania a lot. Their whole thing is a dream match. You know, we have Seth Rollins against AJ in a few weeks. People are considering that a dream match because they've never really had a match. But who are some of in your head dream matches that you would have loved to have seen?
Randy Savage, Rick Rude, I think would have been a great match. We actually saw this at a house show in 1992 at the Coliseum. I believe it was December 26th or 27th, 92. It was Shawn Michaels against Randy Savage. And Randy actually wanted a long feud with Michaels, but Vince wouldn't give it to him. It was for Shawn Michaels' IC title. He went against Randy Savage. I believe Savage won by count out or DQ, one or the other. That would have been great. I think Bret Hart, Randy Savage, we should have gotten a feud out of. I know Bret Hart mentions it in his book that he actually wanted to go against Randy Savage at WrestleMania, not Yokozuna, which I agree. If you're going to rebook WrestleMania, I think had you gone Savage Hart in the main event in a classic 25-minute match, that puts Hart over as your new generation leader, and it's just a great match. Better than we got out of Yokozuna and Hart.
Randy Savage and AJ Styles, that would have been a great match.
Yeah, you're not going to get a bad match out of Randy Savage. I would have loved to have seen AJ Styles and Shawn Michaels go at it. I would have loved to have seen Kurt Angle and Styles go at it. They had some good matches in Impact/TNA, if you remember. I wouldn't mind seeing those two go at it. I'll give you a nice little dream match here. Brock Lesnar and Magnum TA, I think would have been a great match. Tag team.
Nikita Koloff and Brock.
That would have been a great match. I'll give you another good one. Andre the Giant in his prime against Brock Lesnar. That would have been fun to watch.
Oof. Oh, my.
I'll give you another one. Brock Lesnar in his prime against Bruiser Brody in his prime. Cactus Jack against Bruiser Brody in his prime would have been great.
Well, that's where I believe Cactus said he got his inspiration for the Cactus Jack character, right?
Oh, definitely.
Was from Bruiser?
Yeah, I could see that. I could definitely see that. I'll give you another great match. I think Andre in his prime against Undertaker in his prime could have been a great match. I'll give you another one, actually. And this one has always kind of been on my mind. Ricky Steamboat, AJ Styles.
That would have been a great pure wrestling on the vein of a Flair Steamboat match of anyone from this day and age against Steamboat.
But if you want to go box office attraction dream matches where the shoots are going to be endless and just ripping each other to shreds, I would have loved a Rock Rick Rude, HBK Rick Rude. And I'm talking HBK as a heel back in 97, 98. That guy who was, before he found religion and became a little cheesy. That guy would have been great. A Ric Flair HBK feud just from the box office attraction. Or like I said, they had it, but I'm talking earlier HBK stuff. That would have been some fun stuff to watch.
All right, we're going to go to our speed round now. So it's going to be a little word association, name association. I'm going to throw some names out from the annals of pro wrestling history, and just give me your opinion on them. So you ready?
Go ahead.
Okay. Let's start with the head of WCW, Eric Bischoff.
I think he's underrated in a lot of ways. I mean, he took the NWO angle. He took WCW as a whole. And we watched WCW back then before, when he took it over back in 93. And WCW, I would never say it wasn't terrible, but it really had no direction. I mean, your main event matches were still Flair against Steamboat. You were relying on a lot of the old Crockett guys to come up and do stuff for you. I think Nikita was back already. Vader was there. Sting was there. So you had a good roster. They weren't doing anything with it. And he took a roster that didn't have much. And granted, he brought in Hulk Hogan and guys like that, but the guy really turned the business around. He brought in Nitro, where now all of a sudden you had wrestling live for the first time every single week. Went from 1 hour to 2 hours to 3 hours live every week. Without him, guess what? Raw's not live every week for 2-3 hours. We're not getting SmackDown probably on Channel 5 or Fox for those who don't live in the New York area, without Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff really took the business to another level. Granted, he's not the greatest mind as far as innovations go and as far as booking goes. And I think had he taken a long look at the roster he had back in 98, 99, I think he would have realized what he had with the Luchadors, what he had with other guys besides the NWO. Maybe things would have turned out different. But overall, he really changed the business and took it to a different frontier that nobody thought it was capable of getting to.
Right. What about Magnum TA?
Magnum TA, people will say, oh, he was supposed to be, the NWA's answer to Hulk Hogan. I wouldn't say he was I don't think you had an answer to Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. He was part of American pop culture, still is. But I think he would have been your number one face there for quite a few years. It would have been interesting to see how him and Sting and guys like that would have been your next generation for Crockett and WCW as your main faces of the company. Up until that point, your main face was really Dusty Rhodes. And at that point, he was getting on with age. He was a stubby little fat guy. Magnum TA had a look. Wasn't great with the promos, but he had a look. The girls loved him. In ring, he was great. He basically brought to the ring what Hogan couldn't, but what Hogan brought with charisma, Magnum TA couldn't. And as we know, as Vince McMahon always says, your face is what sells on TV. So he had the look, but not the charisma. So take that for what it's worth.
All right. How about Mr. Monday Night, Rob Van Dam?
A complete waste of talent. This guy was given chance after chance after chance after chance after chance. And honestly, he did nothing with it. That guy could have been one of the greats of all time. The guy gets the ECW and WWE championships in one night and then blows it on weed, basically. I mean, this guy just a complete waste of talent. He could have had some of the greatest matches of all time and did have some great matches, whether it was Jerry Lynn and ECW. I know he had a couple of great matches in Impact and TNA, and he had some great matches in WWE as well. He just couldn't keep it together.
All right, let's go with another ECW alumni, Taz.
Oh, an overrated midget. I mean, honestly, I think when he was in ECW, he fit that ECW mode so to speak. Never had any great matches unless he was being carried to a great match. Rob Van Dam, Sabu, Mike Awesome, guys like that kind of carried him. I think he had a persona that got over with a certain ECW fan base, but once he got to the major league, so to speak, and WWE, you kind of saw what he was really made of.
All right, what about the Russian Nightmare, Nikita Koloff?
Really was the first of his kind. He was that first, Goldberg, Brock Lesnar, big, just guy came in the ring and destroyed you. I read a rumor, or I heard on a couple of podcasts, I believe even Bob Backlund mentioned this once, that the plan for WrestleMania 4, as far as maybe like even November, December of '87 went, was that Nikita Koloff was going to come in with his cousin Ivan Koloff, or uncle, whatever it was at that point. They were going to play off Ivan defeating Bruno Sammartino, and they were going to push for a WrestleMania 4 match between Hogan and Nikita, where Nikita was going to go over Hogan, believe it or not. The story that I got is that Nikita went, told Dusty Rhodes the offer that he got, and Dusty at that point, quote unquote, stopped trusting him. And if you notice, from early '88 all the way until when he left, Nikita didn't do much in WCW.
Avi, do you prefer flat top Nikita or bald Nikita?
Oh, bald, of course. Flat top was a joke.
Okay. The Beast, Brock Lesnar.
I never loved Brock Lesnar until Survivor Series 02. I was never a hater of Brock Lesnar. I just never loved him. And Survivor Series 02, he comes out to the Garden. That New York crowd's going nuts, chanting, "Let's go, Lesnar." And that's when I realized, yeah, this guy's got it. I'm a fan of this guy. And then, of course, they take the belt off him, which infuriated me. But that was the point where Brock Lesnar really came into his own. I don't know if he would have became the mainstream star he became without UFC. I think him going to UFC helped both parties. But I would have liked to have seen what he would have done had he stuck around those couple of years and really carved out a nice niche for himself in WWE. He walked away, I believe it was 04, and he came back, 8 years later. Those 8 years could have been some spectacular stuff out of him. It would have been nice to have seen him and Cena in their primes. There's a good dream match right there, headlining WrestleMania together.
And growing up together in WWE. All right, what about the next one? These are going to be a couple of rough ones, so bear with me. Randy Orton.
Never a fan of Randy Orton from day one. To me, just a very overrated worker, very overrated in the ring. I mean, he had one good promo ever. I think that was the Bray Wyatt promo for WrestleMania where he kept repeating himself, "Bray, I'm coming for you." It just, to me, it just, I can't understand why this guy has gotten as far as he's gotten in the business. To me, there's nothing he offers the business. I mean, like I said, his work rate is not terrible. He doesn't have terrible matches as long as he has someone to work with. To me, he never struck that chord with me.
Well, if Randy Orton is to the 21st century, I guess his 20th century counterpart would be Lex Luger.
Yeah, Lex Luger, unless he was being carried by Ric Flair or someone on that level, could never have a good match. He was all luck. But I'll tell you this much. I'll take Randy Orton over Lex Luger in the sense where Randy Orton respects and loves the business, whereas Lex Luger, you've heard it from a few people in interviews, never loved the business, never respected the business. He's basically a failed football player that was doing it for a paycheck. And to me, that's where he falls short. You can see in a lot of his matches and promos, he didn't love the business, whereas Randy Orton loves and respects the business.
What about Lance Storm?
I always liked Lance Storm from his ECW days where he'd open up the show and have a great match, usually against, Louis Spicolli or someone like that. I always thought he was a great worker. I loved him in WCW when he got that initial push. And, he ended up winning, the U.S. title, renamed it the Canadian title. He ended up winning the Cruiserweight title, renamed it the Saskatoon Under 45 kilo title, whatever he called it. And then I think he won the Hardcore title and called it something else. And I loved it. And it was interesting because they kind of took his personality, which everyone complained was non-existent, and played off it, where he would go from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and stuff like that. And I thought that stuff was ingenious. I just wish WWE would have picked up on it because I think he could have done a lot more in WWE with what he was, doing. I think they dropped the ball on Lance Storm.
All right, let's move on to Jim Cornette.
Jim Cornette, to me, had a great mind for the business. I think he was stuck in the past a little bit, kept pushing the NWA agenda. I can't think of any great angles he came up with in WWE. He's fun for an interview now. I mean, his hatred for Vince Russo is just hilarious at times. I don't even know if it's a work or if it's true between those two, but whatever they're doing, it is hilarious. It has me rolling. Outside of that, I mean, he was a great mouthpiece for the Midnight Express. Was never big into Smoky Mountain. At that point, that was basically an ECW, WWE, WCW guy, and I really had no access to Smoky Mountain. I watched some of the stuff now on YouTube. I've watched some of his Ohio Valley booking on YouTube also. A good mind for the business. I think he was past his prime. I don't think he was really meant to be a booker. Not everyone's meant to be a booker. I think he was a great mouthpiece. But I think he's better known now for his feud with Vince Russo more than anything else, which, by the way, is highly, highly entertaining. If you have a minute, YouTube that stuff. Their back and forth is amazing.
Just to go back on Lance Storm, just so we know, the U.S. title was renamed the Canadian Heavyweight Championship. The Cruiserweight Championship was the 100-kilogram and under championship. And the Hardcore title was the Saskatchewan Hardcore International title, SHIT. Okay. Speaking of us, talk to me about Vince Russo. I mean, more than so much his bullshit that's going on with Cornette, but as far as how he impacted the business.
Listen, he changed the business. I think some of the things he did that kind of go astray, so to speak, the Crash TV stuff, it was fun. It was nice. But the one thing that Vince Russo had right, which I wish they would do now, is everybody had an angle. And I loved that when he was writing for WWE and even WCW for that matter. Everybody had an angle. If you were on the roster, you were in some sort of an angle. And what I liked about it was the fact that if you get an injury or if an angle's not working, but two guys on the undercard are having a great angle that the fans are into, you put it on TV, you got something to work with. Not every big match has to be for a title or be for a main eventer. If you have two mid-card guys that are having a great angle that people are into, and you could throw them in a cage match to main event Raw or SmackDown, whatever you're putting on, you've hit it with that. And that's where I think Vince Russo had it right. What I didn't like was how he kind of undermined the business, putting David Arquette as champion, putting himself as champion. I was actually there that night at the Nassau Coliseum when he became champion in that cage match. I mean, that was abysmal. He's made some of the worst decisions in wrestling history, basically destroyed WCW. He destroyed Impact, which had a great roster and did nothing with it. He's one of those guys that he kind of needed Vince as his filter. And that shows that it did work because Vince was a great filter for him. But I like the innovation in the sense of giving everybody a feud. That was something you actually saw early on. George Scott was known for that with WWE back in the 80s. WWE back in the 80s was running 3 house shows a day sometimes. So basically everybody had to have an angle. If you remember back then, I mean, even the Young Stallions had an angle. The Killer Bees had an angle. Everybody had an angle. And I kind of like that philosophy. And that's something I really wish WWE would do now, because guess what? If you got, 9 or 10 solid angles going, and it's a night where your world champion's injured, gets stuck at the airport, or maybe his angle he's in is waning, and you take 2 guys that are having an angle and the fans are really into it, throw them as the main event of Raw. So to me, I think his place in wrestling it's in a few places. I think he's very controversial over the Crash TV stuff and the backstage stuff and how he kind of made things a little ridiculous. But I think he doesn't get enough credit for the innovation of really giving everybody on the roster their own angle.
All right. Let's move on to Chris Jericho.
I was never a huge Jericho fan. He's one of those guys, I call him Mr. Dependable. He's been relatively injury-free throughout his career. He would wrestle every week on Raw or SmackDown, whatever you had him on. He made every pay-per-view. He's never really had a bad match. I think he's just one of those guys you can always depend on. He'll always give you a good match. He'll always give you a good storyline. He'll always give you a good interview. He's just that guy you can always depend on. And it's actually got me thinking if there's anybody on WWE's roster you can get that now out of, and I'm thinking AJ Styles is another guy that is kind of like your Mr. Dependable. No matter what you do with them, you're going to get a solid show out of them.
I mean, you got to give Jericho credit. He sure knows how to reinvent himself over and over again to go on for, 25 years in the business?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite thing he ever did was probably the Man of 1,004 Holds, and they go to a commercial, they come back, and he's still reading off all the holds he knows. I mean, that to me is classic stuff.
Armbar. Abdominal stretch.
So to me, he's one of those guys that you can always depend on him for a solid angle, solid match. You can't lose with that guy.
Okay, the man called Sting.
He was the main face in WCW during some of their darkest times, your pre-NWO days. I think had he kept himself in shape, kept himself tanned, and really kept himself interested in the business and his character, I think things could have turned out a lot better for him. Not to say it was bad, but I was never a huge Sting fan, but I liked Sting. It was one of those things. When Sting came out, you always kind of had fun with it. He was good as the surfer dude. And then he went Crow Sting, and of course that was the biggest angle, WCW ever had. It was one of the biggest angles in wrestling history, Sting and Hogan. And had he kept his interest in the business, kept his interest in his character, and really evolved his character more, I think they could have done a lot more with that angle and a lot more with that character. So in a sense, he almost let us down in a sense as his career moved on, because I think he just lost interest in that character.
All right. What about the Honky Tonk Man?
I think he was your quintessential heel from the 80s. I think he did more with a character than anybody could have. I mean, that was a character nobody cared for. They did everything they could to try to get him over, under, and in between, and they couldn't do it. They throw the belt on him. He's your quintessential heel, always escaping with the belt at the last second. And I would say he did more at that angle than anybody could have possibly imagined. I got to give him all the credit in the world.
The last one on this list I have is Brutus the Barber Beefcake.
As Conrad Thompson calls him, Brutus the fucking Barber Beefcake. It's good to have friends. That's all I'm going to say. Take Hulk Hogan out of the equation, and this guy's waiting table somewhere or rocking a pole at some mail strip joint. He got where he got because of 2 words, Hulk Hogan. It's good to have friends. That's all I'm going to say about that guy.
All right, I'm going to wrap this up with this last bit. And I'm going to read this. During this podcast, I've been writing notes to myself, and I'm going to talk the three. I want from you the three greatest angles for each federation: WWE, WCW, ECW. I wrote mine down, so I'm going to read mine off, and you tell me if you agree, disagree, and go into a little story if you got some backstory. For WCW, I think there's no question, the NWO.
Agreed.
Now, was that stolen from New Japan, or was that created by Erich himself?
I'm going to say no. I'm going to say it wasn't stolen. Let me tell you why. Because if you go and put Sting in that situation, okay, it's stolen. It's Hulk Hogan turning heel. That's what made the NWO what it was. Okay? I'll always say this. If Hulk Hogan doesn't even join the NWO and just turns himself heel, it's still going to be a huge angle. As big as the NWO was, it was fun because it was gang warfare, this and that, led by Hulk Hogan. Hall and Nash could have came in, started the NWO, been the NWO, and it would have been a nice little kick in the pants for wrestling. It would have been big. Once Hulk Hogan joined them and turned heel, that's when it really took off. So it wasn't so much an NWO angle, so to speak. It was Hulk Hogan turning heel, if you think about it.
Okay, as far as WWE, I mean, I think it's an even tie. You got Hogan Andre and Austin Vince.
I'm going to go Austin Vince, and I'll tell you why. As big as Hogan Andre was, and you get 93,000 at the Silver Dome, you get 33 million. Watching on Channel 4 or NBC for Hogan Andre, but Austin and Vince took wrestling to that next level. I always look at the biggest feuds of all time, the biggest angles of all time, where it took the business. And as big as Hogan Andre took the business, Austin McMahon just took it to a different level. I mean, Austin shirts at one point were the most sold shirt on the planet, more than Calvin Klein t-shirts. That shows you how big that angle was. And it basically created the greatest character in the history of wrestling, Mr. McMahon.
Who's still going today. Okay, ECW, to me, the greatest angle they had was Raven Dreamer.
I think it was their one of their better angles, but I think the best angle they had to be Sabu Taz. That just took ECW to that next level, took them to pay-per-view. It really kind of shook up the industry, so to speak.
All right, well, that's going to wrap it up. I think we had a great conversation. As I said, I've proven to all of you, Avi is an walking, talking encyclopedia of professional wrestling knowledge and history. So, if you got a question for him, we'll be happy to answer it here. And, of course, you just got to sign up at willyousstoppodcast.com. Sign up your email. Send us your questions. You can find us also on YouTube. You can leave some questions in the comments there. You can tweet us at willyousstoppod. Ask us questions there, and we get your questions. Avi will be more than happy to answer them. And the fun part is we're not even going to tell Avi the question. We're going to do it live like I did this. Avi didn't know any of these questions or these names I was dropping. So that's how quick he is. So I got to give Avi props. I'm going to stop because I'm putting you over way too much now. I don't want to sell. I don't want to sell you. You yell at me for selling. I'm not selling you. I'm not doing it.
Well, people, listen, any questions you have, hit me up. This was unscripted. This was uncooked, raw, if you will.
If you will.
So bring it on. Bring all the questions you want. I will be happy to answer them. Anything you want to know about, bring it on.
Well, guys.